I wonder if it's gotten to the point where any of them are like, am I going to end up on nerdy? Like, are we causing any of you anxiety? I really hope not, because we love you all. And yeah. Hello and welcome to another zany episode of Nerdy West Coast Swing, the podcast with pixels where the anchors are out of this world and the points don't matter. We are here to help train your eye so you can learn faster and dance better. I'm Cassie Winter.
I'm Alicia Marshall. If you're wondering who are we to be analyzing these pros, Cass and I both have extensive training and experience in both partnered and solo dancing. Today, we're taking a look at a recent video from Budapest, Chris Dumont, and Brandon Anderson.
We're going to go ahead and throw a link up in a card above. It will also be in the description box below. So go ahead and go watch the video first and then come back and we will get to the frame by frame analyzing. To the screen share.
If I happen to be looking away or disappear in my camera, I have dogs that I'm training right now. So I need to engage with them for a moment.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No worries. So one of the things that I noticed in this dance, like particularly with Chris, is his use of the space inside of his frame to do a lot of musicality while never getting overextended in his frame. And so I'm going to want to highlight a fair amount of that because it is pretty cool. Was there anything in particular that you noticed about Brandon in this dance?
I just really love her styling choices. And she's doing it a lot more where she can get back into the correct pitch, or she's staying in a correct pitch. And I don't mean correct pitch as in what she's done previously is totally incorrect, but sometimes when you do certain styling, you can kind of get into a pitch as a follow where you no longer are able to hang back behind the lead. And she it looks like she's getting a lot better at incorporating all of her normal stuff, but then still being able to stay in a more back pitched position, or at least ending in one, so that she can more easily catch back into that being led, or just stay in it the whole time. So that's just kind of my overall what I noticed with her.
Awesome. Part of me actually wants to talk about their frame through the shenanigans. So what they're both doing really well is like, this is a moment where it is helpful to not greatly affect the handhold because it starts out behind Bryn's back in a hammerlock position, which is a more compromised position. And if you've seen any of our previous videos on like a hammerlock hip catch and then release, like you're applying the leading force to the fellow's hip or ribs, not the hand, and pulling the hand like the string on a top, because that's really hard on the fellow's shoulder. So they're both trying to isolate the handhold as much as they can so they can do their respective. I don't know what to call this, but I'm here for it. Uh,
Leg work.
leg work. Add it to the swing content Bible. Uh, and then they're also both managing their space really well. So that way, when they come back to a standard anchor position, they both have enough rope to be over top of themselves. Is there anything you wanted to add to the shenanigans?
I just wanted to add, can you just like draw a line along Bryn's arm when she gets back into kind of that anchored position? Just so you can see that she's not getting overextended.
Yep. So I think I also want to take a moment to highlight Chris's pitch throughout this situation because he ends up sitting back into the connection. And all right, so he is on his left foot. And we're gonna do the top of his head, and we're just gonna go. His pitch is actually over the back of the arch of his left foot at this point in time. So he's pitched back. As he places his right foot down, he's starting to shift backwards even further. And then at the point where he is actually picking up his left foot and trying to strike it behind him, I want us to pay attention to that vertical line moving through space. And that's actually what's leading Bryn through her one. And the thing I want to highlight is that this situation is on this side of that pitch line instead of the legs being straight up and the head being way forward of the feet. So when we're talking about sitting back into a connection, this is what we mean. The net pitch is back and the hips are just even further back.
Yeah.
This is another example of them entering their anchor from a non-standard situation.
Yeah.
Is this arm work? So the first one was leg work, and now this is arm work.
Arm work.
Yes. There's also a hint of jazz hands.
There is. Yeah.
And one of the things I want to highlight for Chris is going into the anchor, he's erring on the side of being really close. So that way he actually has lots of room to move away. So he, at this point in time, has taken Bryn's hand or her arm, is
Yeah.
letting it drag down to her hand. But you can see how bent his elbow is. And when he's first connecting with her, his elbow is actually back past his center line, and his elbow's close into his side. So he has a lot of rope.
Mhm.
And what that allows him to do is after he strikes his right foot here, he has that rope to determine how far he actually shifts his weight down line to gauge the anchor correctly.
Yeah. I want to add, just talking about a little bit of
Let me
the
get
visual following, because this is a good example of it. We don't want to use the visual following too frequently, because when we're using correct technique, we shouldn't really have to be thinking that hard about what is my lead wanting me to do. We should just kind of naturally be following without thinking too much about it. Uh, at least without thinking too much about, like, what are we going into? What steps do I need to take based on what we're going into? Um, but this is a good example of kind of a visual moment that is a good time for visual following, because she sees that he's driving towards her, but not reconnecting. So she's like, okay, well, I'm going to also move back. And then she kind of sees, as he's like breaking out of their little hand arm work, that she's like, okay, now we're resetting into an anchor. And she stops and is then resetting into her normal anchor position. So it's just a really good example of a time that you would want to use visual following. In general, you don't want to use it too much.
well, we're still here. I just want to highlight a little bit more of what I was saying earlier.
Mhm.
So what happens is they're setting a center counterpoint with the hand hold, and then they're both stretching away from it. And then Chris moves that center counterpoint through space to bring Bryn forward.
Yeah.
And him saving all of that rope right here is what allows him to do that while having so much movement in his own body.
Mhm. This is different just because of the way that she's getting into it. She's actually doing like a hook behind initially. But she's not doing it in a way that she's moving back away from Chris. She's just kind of moving sideways. Um, and that's important because you don't want to, if you're going to hook behind like that, you don't want to do any traveling backwards, because then you can get easily overextended. And so the way she's doing it, she's kind of at a diagonal hooking behind her, and then she's letting it move her forward instead of backwards. And so she's taking a significant step towards Chris as he's still moving away from her.
And I just want to
And
highlight that her right heel lifting right here is what's allowing her to have such a large hook behind.
Mhm.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
I was just gonna say, she already gets into a relaxed arm position right here before they're fully connected with the hands. So we know that there's still room to move away from each other. And therefore she is okay closing the feet and settling more backwards.
Visually, because as she's striking onto her left foot here, she's facing us in the camera. The pitch is a little bit different because usually we talk about it where we are forward and back relationship to our arch. But since she is positioned uh, perpendicular to Chris and facing us instead, it ends up actually looking more extreme aesthetically.
Mhm.
Um, but as she pivots that right foot and collects her feet to come forward, she's still leaning into that away feeling that she set up with that
Mhm.
foot strike in order to come forward on time instead of early and to let Chris actually lead her forward.
Yeah. And you can tell that she is still more pitching back because as she's hovering that foot that's stepping forward, her right foot, it's the heel that's about to touch the floor. It's not like midfoot.
You mean her right foot?
Yeah, that's what I said.
Okay.
If you're not still pitched back enough, you won't be able to put the heel to the floor initially. You'll land more like midfoot
Mhm.
a lot of the times because you're too far forward.
And landing midfoot ends up basically looking flat-footed, so you're not gonna be rolling through your foot. And then I wanted to highlight how, yet again, Chris is setting himself up to have plenty of rope going into the anchor. So after he does this face loop and he does his rotation on his right foot, notice how much he is pitched towards Bryn. So if I draw a line straight down from there, he's really pitched to the right and forward in order to stay close to Bryn. And the way he's able to do this seemingly defying gravity moment is because his left leg is in part countering the situation. But what this is doing is allowing his right arm to be really close to Bryn. So they have lots of extra room in the rope. They actually go wrist to wrist and then slide to a handshake hold. And it's because he set himself up to have that extra rope for them as a partnership with the way he was rotating. All right, we've got some illusion turns. So if we pay attention to this handhold, it's basically just an ongoing outside turn. If we pay attention to this handhold, it's an ongoing inside turn, but that disconnects when it runs into the other connection. And depending on the partnership, that disconnect can happen near the handhold. I think that's how like Roro and Laureen Baldovi do their illusion turns. But what Chris and Bryn are doing is they're breaking that handhold at Bryn's forearm.
Yeah,
I need
like
to try that. That looks more comfortable. I don't know, when all the hands are up here.
yeah, right.
Too much information.
Push together.
Is this like this is my left hand, this is my right hand. That loses all meaning when there are four hands and they're all in the same space. Anyways,
But yeah, so the illusion turns, I just wanted to go over those because I know that they're a more complicated thing because there's two different things happening. Um, and as a follow, you want to make sure that you're releasing and um, letting that slide past your arm and leaving the hand open to be caught.
Yeah. And as a leader, you really need to make sure that this hand is doing its job. So being consistent with rotations around the follow's head, and keeping the timing strong. As soon as the leader either changes the timing or changes the shape, that's when it starts getting muddy and can be really confusing for the follow. So the hand that is actually leading the turns that does not disconnect, that's the one that is the most important.
Mhm.
I want to talk about this anchor of Chris's because it is huge. He is taking up so much space, but he is not leading Bryn off time and he's connecting correctly. So if we pay attention, what do I want people to pay attention to first? Okay, let's start with the handhold. So together they are setting a center counterpoint. Chris actually lets it come physically closer to Bryn. So that way her handhold can actually relax downward into this position. And that is a way of creating more rope. You can't force a follow to bend their elbow if you bring their hand closer to their body.
Yeah.
Um, so he's just bringing it closer to her. So there's rope, extra rope on her side. He's not just coming into his own elbow. He did both. And so there's so much extra rope in this connection. And then the other thing he's doing is he's making it look even more exaggerated by having his knees
Yeah.
closer to her. So when he goes to do this giant step back for his one, here, he's way over here.
Yeah. And I want to add to that not only his knees, but his hips are slightly
Ah,
more
yes,
forward as well. Not
yes,
forward, but towards Bryn.
yeah, good catch. And so from there to there, via contrast, it looks huge. But because he had all of this extra rope here, he's able to take that huge step while still allowing her to have as much rope as she needs until the one when he brings her forward. So there, here, okay, here we're gonna do. Yeah, there's the handhold. There's the handhold, and then there. So you can see how the handhold doesn't travel very far until the end. So that is him leaving Bryn behind while moving himself. He looks like Elvis in this picture, like he just strummed a guitar. Anyways,
I see it.
yes. So when we're talking about frame and managing your space, it's also in context of the partnership. Like there's your rope, but then there's the partnership's rope,
Yeah.
and taking into account both things can be really helpful for both partners. I would say.
Did you talk about how close his arm is to his body?
Ooh, right here. Yeah, he's moving himself towards the handhold.
Not only that, but he's like tucking his elbow to his side, is kind of what I wanted to point out.
Mhm,
I just wanted to mention it right here just because he's taking uh, quite a large step towards her. And also, he's tucking that elbow to his side, which is creating a lot more space for him to move away from.
mhm.
Because the hand is moving slightly more towards the middle. And so he's really tucking into his side.
Yeah,
And now he has like a lot of rope.
yeah. So, like, what I see, uh, for, like, leaders trying to create this aesthetic and they don't understand that there's their rope and the partnership's rope,
Mhm.
they end up getting to the end of the partnership's rope really early.
Yeah.
So like right here, uh they would already be at max rope.
Right.
And then what ends up happening is the leader can't move their shoulder or their hand any further down the slot. So what they do is they send their hips back to compensate. And then
Mhm.
that's when we get that whole legs are straight, but the body and head weight is forward.
Yeah.
And that's extreme overextension. So this is the evidence that I was describing earlier of him defying gravity.
His defying gravity.
Yeah, right here. He just he hops out of that. I don't it's fun.
Rebounds.
I just this is so great. Think.
Painful to me
I
personally.
know. My knees, I was one of those hypermobile kids that sat like that in like the W position my entire childhood, and now my knees are busted. Um
I just never like I can and I could, but like I just never have because I'm like, this feels wrong.
because
That's
it is.
the
Don't do
only reason.
that. All right. Side note, I want to point out that he does this hop to get his feet just a little bit closer to her. So he lands pitched back on his right foot so he can brace against her if he needs to.
And in the perfect position out of that really
I know.
uncomfortable position on the floor.
I know. It was like I and that's where practicing your technique can be so powerful is your body just can reset to it. It's like his little hop in the air was shaking the etch a sketch and his body just knew where to land. That's essentially what's happening.
Much. Yeah. So I want to take a look at this simply because of what happens with the arm. Because of the way that it goes up and over her head, it gets more or less disconnected in terms of like you're not gonna be able to lead anything from that position. Um, and even when she gets back, she does this little nice hip styling, but she gets back to like facing Chris, and just because of the way that they got there, like her arm is still up and it's starting to come down. And so she actually continues dropping it and kind of rotates into it in order to get the amount of tension that she needs to be led. Because if she just stays like facing him and doesn't continue rotating a little bit more into the arm, you're going to have some slack. And that just made me think of Andrew Slack. I don't know. Shout out Andrew Slack, I guess.
Mia
Uh,
Primavera just posted a TikTok about when she goes into the splits and sometimes she'll like shift her hips to do the opposite split, then come back on rhythm. And she was just highlighting how long she's been doing that. The first time she did it was like at Rose City, like 2018 or earlier. And so that came on, and Andrew Slack was there. And her video cuts to him just like kind of like losing his mind and walking onto the floor partly from the MC station.
that sounds about right.
Chef's kiss.
That's what I was saying was that just because of the angle of the arm, if she only stays facing him and just drops the arm, it's there's still not going to be enough tension for her to be led on time. So she kind of corrects it herself by continuing into the arm.
And then I want to highlight because she is ending up in this sitting back position.
Mhm.
But even though this isn't like shifted to the right and has a pitch back relationship to this foot, she does have a pitched back relationship to her front right foot. So she can use that as a
Yeah.
brace.
Yeah.
That's the word I want to help her get that tension as she's taking away rope.
Yeah.
rotating to her right, like you were talking about.
Yeah. And also the reason that her continuing to rotate into her arm creates uh more tension, less slack in the connection is because you can see her right shoulder is rotating backwards as her body is rotating. So that's what's creating it, is because she is setting the right shoulder back.
Oh, it's over here. And so many drawings later, it's over here.
Yeah, so that's one way if you are ever in a position where you don't have enough tension in the rope, you can always kind of over rotate and push the shoulder back to create that without having to move back away physically.
Yeah. And then what Chris is doing to help facilitate that is he's not only tethering lengthwise, but he's rotating to his left, bringing his right shoulder forward and across, which is having the net result of this handhold um, going from here. Bird's eye view of the slot. Meow, meow. It's going from this rail to this rail, so her right shoulder can move back and away.
Yeah, and this is also a position that creates acceleration.
Mhm. Alright, here's another good example of, a leader being sitting back, also pitched back, so he's not, like, up in her space. He's not, like, over top of his feet and in front of his feet, so
Mhm.
there's still plenty of room in between them, but you can
Yeah.
see how here, I'm not using my ruler anymore apparently, um, but we have that situation going on, so pitched back, hips are further back than the head.
Mhm. Yeah. And the reason that this is fine is because he has his arms extended so far in front of him as well, connected to
Mhm.
her.
Yeah, because in closed position, the rope is the leader's right arm.
Mhm.
So the leader has to manage both ends. Oh, yeah. This is another example. I think this is just a managing space episode. I'm not
Yeah.
messing with it. Um, managing space for, first of all, an alternating turn and then double turn. There's a hop again. He does another hop to adjust at the end. Oh my god. Anyways,
It does go with the vibe of the music,
it
but
does, it does, it does. But once again, he just lands perfectly, where he needs to be. So, first important thing, this is a you go, I go. We're not both rotating at the same time when it's alternating turns. The word alternate is
yeah.
important. So, Bryn turns first, then Chris, and you can see once again, he has this extreme forward pitch in order for both himself and his hand to be close enough to Bryn so she's not having to break her frame
Mm.
through these turns at the end. And it's also allowing him to keep his feet further away from her until he's ready to start posting again. Because sometimes when you're trying to follow a follow as they're traveling through turns, it can feel like I don't want to trip them. Like if you're staying close enough for your arm to be close enough for the frame. So this is where forward pitch is actually really helpful because your upper body and your therefore your hand is going to be physically closer to them than your feet. But then you need to get your feet underneath you at the end. And once again, he's accomplishing that with a little hop and he's getting his right foot out in front of him so
Mhm.
he can use it as a brace. And then he does the same thing with his left foot. So he's able to be pitched back through the anchor.
Yeah.
I think I just want to highlight the timing of the way he hops and strikes
Mm.
and like slows down into this weight transfer.
Yeah.
Oh, so good.
'Cause I just want to talk about a lot of times this particular type of movement, you really have to like disconnect from what's happening um, in the connection. And she actually does this in a way she does her styling and it does kind of disconnect, but as soon as she sees that he's trying to move away, reconnect with her, she then sets the shoulder back in order to reconnect and come forward.
Once again, she's using that as a brace
Mhm.
to connect with him.
Yeah.
Actually, we're like, if we just watch the handhold, the way that it's pretty like smoothly and consistently moving through space because he's leading it in this great big arc,
Yeah.
right? And he's setting a center counterpoint like right here, so it's traveling through space less. And then he goes to lead, and the handhold is moving through space,
Yeah.
and she's letting that tether through her body,
Mhm.
from her hand to her shoulder. And then
So
she
I
has
just wanted to point
this.
that out because it's quite a unique reconnection.
Mhm. Right. This is one of the few places where having more of a forward pitch is really helpful.
Yeah.
Um, like he is countering her so she can have some tension in her hands, so they are moving counter to each other through this basket whip variation. But it's not a lot because he doesn't want to yeet her backwards through space. He wants it to be gentle. And then he's exaggerating that posture for an aesthetic. He doesn't have to be that bent over. This is why he's forward pitched in this place as opposed to on an anchor, because it helps leave the follow where they are.
Yeah.
Will you talk about how she goes from this kind of forward pitch to back pitch here?
Yeah. So Bryn does go from being pretty forward pitched to more of a backward pitch. And the way she's kind of doing that is she's letting her foot like so because she's forward pitched and like quite drastically so. She's kind of letting that lean, let her fall forward, and she's kind of catching herself with her feet out quite a ways in front of her. So the right foot initially, she's trying to just kind of trying to drive it down into the floor. And then, so she's stopping the fall forward with that. And then with the next step, she's really reaching out in front of her and she's like more or less swinging through with that leg while kind of leaving the upper body more where it is. So she's trying to resettle. So again, the first step is kind of breaking the fall. And the second step is resetting the pitch.
So this is like a really clear example how the pitch is changed through foot placement,
Mhm.
and that's basically what's happening this whole dance. And in West Coast Swing, instead of thinking of like your head on top of your feet and trying to move your head this way to change pitch, we want to think of placing our feet underneath us in different ways to accomplish the pitch we need in the moment.
Yep.
And in our recent like Talking Heads episode where we were talking about the whole feedback, keep your feet underneath you. This is an example of why that's a complex thing to say, because what getting your feet underneath you means it will change in different contexts in order to accomplish the correct connection and follow through in that moment of a pattern. And then, like we talked about in that episode, the ways you can have your feet not underneath you varies from person to person. So each person will then have to have a tailored solution for them to get their feet where it needs to be for them. All right, we have another sequence of intense managing space on Chris's part. So the first thing he's doing is this up and over with his elbow. And in order to do that, he needs to have her hand comfortably near his shoulder and armpit to do that. So he's making sure he's physically close enough to her for that to work. And again, he's pitching forward through this in order to not get tripped up in each other's feet,
Yeah.
which is really helpful. And then because he's noticing, oh, we may actually be a little too far forward, he places his left foot closer to where he's going to be in order to get under her arm comfortably. So this whole situation, Bryn isn't at risk of getting pulled off her feet at all because of the way he's dancing it. And that's how it should be.
I just wanted to point out something here about Bryn, because we've been talking about how she's being been more back pitched, and here she is forward pitched because of the way that Chris is moving her arm. So she's kind of getting like stopped before she's able to finish settling backwards. Um, and so she is staying there, but then as soon as he's giving her this up and over the head, she's able to um, switch it back
Mm-hmm.
into a normal pitch because she is then able to have more space again. But I just wanted to mention that because she is pitched forward for that. But it's because he's like stopping her immediately so he can do the thing with his arm.
Yeah. And also, like on a 3 and 4 in general, both roles are more pitched forward
Yes.
in a
Yeah.
basic.
Yeah. And so that's basically what I was saying, is that he's pausing her there before she can finish
Mhm.
the anchor. So she's getting stopped at a forward pitch.
I was actually thinking if I would be brave enough to do a before after of like my following to a fast song just a year ago to my following to a fast song now and being people I'm just as disabled. I have not magically found a cure for POTS. I have not been training cardiovascularly in any way, shape, or form. I'm still miserable in the second video, but it looks like I couldn't be bothered and it looks easy. And in the first video, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Be like, this is literally all just technique changes, people. That's it. I don't know. So we'll see if I'm vulnerable. I feel vulnerable enough for that.
Yeah.
And if I ended up
Um,
putting that conversation in the final video for YouTube, let us know in the comments. You want to see that? Do you care? Would that be helpful for you? And it's my following for reference. Leading is always lazy.
it's always been fine.
Leading's always been fine. Okay, I want to highlight this step right here because the way he's taking this really large step, there's kind of like a swung arc to his pelvis. So yeah, his foot's way out ahead of him,
Yeah.
but he's
I
kind of
also
delaying what
I was gonna say, I also love the face that he's making because he's like, I'm gonna do something as he looks at her.
he's delaying his weight shift. So he's staying weighted towards his left foot for as long as possible
Mhm.
before he releases it off the floor. Um, and there's someone whose videos I've been watching recently. You probably know who you are, but I will let you remain anonymous. And I've just been one of the things I've been noticing is when they go to take a large step, that they tend to, at this point in time, once this foot strike happens, their center is further toward that foot, almost like they're striking and they're already split weight when that foot strike happens,
Yeah.
or sometimes farther. And it just has this at least in this person's videos in particular, has this uncanny valley effect to it where I'm like, what, what is it? And this description of what I'm seeing isn't implying what the solution is. I'm not going to go into what the solution is right now. But it is something I see, kind of like I was talking about earlier, with leaders who try to take a big step after already being at the end of their rope and they end up like bent over forward, like a bend and snap kind of a
Yeah.
situation. This is another one of those things I see with leaders taking a large step. They're indecisive about which foot is going to have the majority of the weight for the longest in that weight transfer.
Yeah. And
Uh,
I think, sorry.
no, it's good. The last thing I was going to say, because like if you're wanting to have a split weight effect, you would need to spend more time there.
Yeah.
And if you're not spending more time there, it kind of looks indecisive. Like what are you trying to do with this weight
Right.
transfer?
I was going to say, so I think that some of that is probably partially because as a lead, you're driving through the floor, you're pushing through the floor more, just in general. And so if you're already kind of just used to doing that, driving when you're stepping is going to put you too forward.
Yeah.
Um, and so my guess is that a lot of leads are probably that's just kind of their conditioned. They're driving through the floor more.
Yeah. And that's why on our Talking Heads episode, again recently, we were talking about how there's a difference between correct technique and then adding power to that technique. You should be able to do your technique with just naturally how much power there's going to be in relationship to your body to the floor. You're not engaging your muscles to add power. You're
Yeah,
just engaging your muscles to stay together,
yeah,
basically.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think that a lot of leads tend to have their base at driving through the floor,
with
uh,
power, yeah.
even if they're not necessarily using it.
Mhm.
I think that tends to be the baseline for them just because of the backwards movement that they're doing more frequently. And so you need to understand and work on that difference of powering through the floor and holding yourself back because the holding yourself back is what follows do more often. And when we drive through the floor more as we're moving forward, it creates exactly this problem
Yeah.
where we're too far forward.
The other thing I just want to highlight, so there are different ways to accomplish this, but one of the extra little things that Chris is doing here is he's letting his hips get closer to his next foot faster than his head, which
Yeah.
is helping create the delay.
Mhm.
One of the other ways to do that is to let the head catch up to the foot first and the hips stay back, and then the hips swing under.
Yeah.
Um, Basically, if both the head and the hip are moving at the same rate, you're gonna have a problem. Uh, getting over that foot for the most part.
Yeah. And I also want to point out with this because a lot of times you'll hear that, you don't want to reach the foot too far away from you. And
Mhm,
he's very much reaching quite a ways away from him, but he's also dropping into the knee of the standing leg in
mhm,
order to reach. So he's not like just reaching by tipping his upper body forward. He's reaching by creating less distance by bending into the knee.
mhm,
And that is what's going to be the proper way to do it, where you can still keep yourself settled back. Because in general, we don't want to reach. In general, what happens if we reach is that we're reaching without dropping into the knee, and that's tipping the body forward
mhm,
because of the hip it's going with it. But if we're standing and we just have our foot like our heel on the ground, just in general, wherever it is comfortably, if we bend the knee, the heel is going to slide away from us, right? So it's just naturally giving us more room to reach, but we don't want to do that where we tip forward.
last thing I wanna add here, because 'cause we've been talking about functionality first and foremost. But the other thing that this does is it creates that contrast again,
Yeah.
where he's staying closer to Bryn, and then suddenly he's moving through space,
Yeah.
and it gives that moving through space even more emphasis
Mhm.
aesthetically and musically because of that differentiation in spacing and timing.
Yeah.
Ooh, I love the way she adjusts the timing of her rotation here and then flows into this walk towards the audience.
Mhm.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So the way that she's kind of adjusting the timing is because she's leaving the hip behind her and the foot behind her. And that's generally slowing down the rotation, right? So when we're turning, we want to keep the feet relatively together and we want to keep even weight on it. And we want to keep the body all together in one piece. So when she leaves the hip and the foot behind, that then changes the amount of rotation because there's more weight coming from behind now. So it slows it down. And then she uses that in order to basically kind of uh, decide where she wants to place the foot. Because when we're just going through rotations, we kind of land where we land. So she's kind of breaking it. And then in order to place the foot where she wants to place it, which is kind of diagonally away from her. And then she keeps rotating. So she's not stopping the momentum and then going a different direction. She's slowing it down and just changing. And there is a difference between that because we don't want to stop the momentum if we don't have to.
She's also in part sending that energy down into the floor because
Yeah.
she's more upright and she goes from upright to more of a plie in her standing leg that she's rotating on.
Mhm.
And that also helps slow her momentum because she's taking forward momentum that's carrying her through space and sending it down into the ground.
Yeah, and the other thing is that because she's then extending the arm, so we have a lot more weight away from the original like center of the rotation, and that slows things down. Um, so she's really taking that kind of control over the turn and then continuing it, but creating something slightly different because there's less drive in it. There's less momentum in it. So you can kind of slowly adjust, change the shape of it. If you have really tight, fast spins, you really can't do that. You really don't have too much control over that in terms of like where and how you're landing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you can only do so much.
Yeah.
But if you're slowing it down, you then have more control to do something different.
Here's another example of a handhold crossing the slot in order for Bryn's right shoulder to rotate back into the connection. So you can see how much from this angle in particular, the handhold is crossing the slot. And not only the handhold, he's prepping his body on the other side of the slot. So they're not in front of each other.
Mhm.
So that way he can send her arm over him, but there's plenty of space in front of her for her body to go. So here's another example of Chris setting up enough space for something to happen. So he's making sure that he's placing the handhold like right up on top of his shoulder. So that way Bryn knows to not travel too far away from him, although she has a lot of momentum going into it.
But she doesn't have
He,
enough that she's getting up over the feet. She's able to kind of break herself.
yeah. And instead of Chris kind of bowing forward from here and bringing the handhold further this way or leaving it in place, he's actually letting the handhold actually move towards Bryn just a little bit to arrive in this shape so she has room and she's not being pulled off of her feet.
Yeah.
And it's also kind of like it makes it more of an illusion because yeah, he's technically off balance here. Uh,
If he didn't have her weight behind him, he
yeah,
wouldn't look
yeah,
hold that in any shape or form
yeah.
for any time.
And because he's sending his right arm and the top of his head back, that momentum is actually part of what's countering his weight. So it's not just Bryn, but it's the way he's throwing parts of his body through space away, which allows him to like hover here for
Yeah.
longer before having to step forward and catch himself. And this is another really great example of him just landing perfectly
Hmm.
because he needs to be forward pitched in order to lead her down line. And look at where his head weight is relative to his feet.
Hmm. Because of what he just did, she gets into this moment where she's tipping with her upper body. And so she's doing that same thing that I was talking about earlier, where she catches with that first foot, and then with the second foot, she's getting herself pitched back again. So really what you're doing there is you're kind of keeping the upper body in like a somewhat similar spot in space as long as you can, so that you can take the feet from behind you to in front of you. I also want to add this is kind of an extreme example of what happens when follows aren't pitched back at the end of the slot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I say extreme because her arm is up um, instead of down. But
Yeah, this is
this
a
is more or
very
less the same thing.
non-normal position.
Would you say?
This is a very non-normal position to end up in. But they're
Yeah.
doing it on purpose
Yeah.
too. You don't want to be ending up here in your basics.
No,
That would be
no,
bad.
but this is the extreme example of what is happening for a lot of follows in that when they get overextended,
Mm-hmm.
they get to that point where their upper body is just slightly pitched forward too much. But because a lot of them don't know how to catch and reposition, um, they just end up kind of continuing to fall forward. So you're ahead of the lead
Mm-hmm.
as an extreme example.
I also
Because
just
I think sometimes it is hard to see with more subtle angles in anchors.
yeah, I also want to highlight because she's also going down
Mhm.
while she's sending her feet out in front of herself. If she weren't going down, she would be tripping over her toes to get her feet out ahead of herself. So it's actually doing a swinging
Mhm.
motion. I loved this dance, but I wasn't expecting this episode to be so juicy.
Yeah, I know.
Um, thank you, Chris and Bryn, for this beautiful piece of artwork.
Mhm.
Pillow
Whatever
right
music
in the
that
butt.
was.
Bam. We did have a question on a previous video, but when I went to find the comment, it appears to have disappeared. But it was somebody asking about if we could talk about muscle groups and maybe draw pertinent things about muscle groups. But we were wondering if anybody has like a particular muscle group and technique involved with that muscle group that you want us to focus on, because the whole body is that's a lot of muscle groups. So give us some direction and we'll happily talk about some muscles. And our next episode will be with Marcus Smith. So definitely subscribe if you have not subscribed.
See you all next time.
Yeah. I just realized I can pull off like a horror story effect, like flashlight under the chin with my second monitor. And also the way just from our perspective in the camera, the way Chris's face just like pops up right here.
Hey,
That beaming smile. This is so good.
we've had so many distractions today.
ADHD.
You know what? I actually didn't take my medicine today, so yeah.
feel like that section right there should end up on Austin Coyce's meme Facebook page. Somebody turn this right here into a GIF. Just
crawling on the floor.